right, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Johns Hopkins, and on behalf of Baltimore Heritage and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation, want to say thank you for joining us in what I think is our 8th virtual Histories talk on Friday afternoons. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. And those of you who have stuck with us, thanks for doing so. Also, thank you very much for all of you who have contributed, voluntarily contributed for this talk, whether it's $5 or what. I think that you can count the number of staff of Baltimore Heritage and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation on one hand, and you can leave off 2 fingers in doing so. So your contributions are incredibly appreciated. Thank you. Before I introduce Lisa Keir, just want to give a plug for our upcoming talks. Let me make sure I get this right, the dates right. On June 26th, we're going to be partnering also with the Baltimore Museum of Industry on a talk about how workplaces are going to be designed as we move through this COVID-19 crisis. And we're taking a break on July 3rd, happy 4th weekend, but we'll be back on July 17th with a talk on green book sites, easy for me to say, green book sites across Maryland with Ann Bruder. All right, Lisa, we try to do these pretty lickety-split here and keep them to half an hour. So, but in introducing Lisa Keir, I just have to say, Lisa has been a Baltimore lover, a Baltimore researcher, and a history lover for decades. And in fact, if anybody's taken Baltimore Heritage's tour of Mount Vernon Place, that basically came from Lisa 15 or 20 years ago when she kindly shared her notes with us. So she's been doing this for a while. And in fact, the talk that she's going to give is based on a walking tour through the building called Taste and Tours. So we were supposed to be doing this not on Friday at 1, but on a Thursday at say 5, and we would have a old-fashioned cocktail specially made for us as we followed Lisa through the building. So sorry to disappoint. I think we're going to get a great presentation, but sans cocktail. Sorry about that. Lisa is a trustee of the Garrett-Jacobs Mansion Endowment Fund. Many of us know the mansion for the Engineers Club that occupies it. The Endowment Fund is a separate nonprofit organization whose mission is to maintain and improve the mansion itself, and it's been doing a fantastic job for 15 years. So one final note before turning it over to Lisa Keir is that if you have questions, please put them in the Zoom chat box down at the bottom of the screen, and after Lisa's talk, we'll get to as many of them as we can. Thanks so much, and Lisa, take it away.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to give the tour. I just wish that we could actually be there to give the tour because it's so much more fun to be able to introduce the building to everybody and to get to see their reactions as they're looking at the building. As you probably all know, the Garrett-Jacobs Mansion is a National Register Historic Landmark, a contributing structure to the Mount Vernon Historic District, and arguably the finest Gilded Age mansion in Baltimore.
Lisa, I'm going to cut you off. I think we need to you need to share your screen.
Well, okay. Well, let me just get back and do that. I thought I had.
There we go.
Are we on now?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you. All righty. Well, as I said, I just wish everybody were here to be able to actually go in the mansion with me so I could do the tour like I'm used to doing it, with looking you in the eye and saying, isn't this lovely? And making you stand at the bottom of the stairway and look up and say, wow, that's gorgeous. But since we can't do that, we'll just have to pretend today. So we're going to pretend that we're here at this beautiful building, which is a National Register Historic Landmark, a contributing structure to the Mount Vernon Cultural District, and arguably the finest example of Gilded Age architecture in Baltimore. The mansion was made up of 4 of 3 row houses that you can see in the front, and a 4th that's behind that you can't see. And if you look at the picture, the one that is on the right-hand side of the mansion, number 11, was the first of the buildings that became the mansion. The second one, number 9, has the bow front on it. And the third one, number 7, has the flat front on it. So those are the 3 parts of the mansion that we're going to be looking at. And if you remember back to the first slide, it said 1 owner. So we're going to talk about the 1 owner, 2 architects, Stanford White and John Russell Pope, 3 owners who were the Garretts and Jacobs, and then the Shriners, and then the Engineers Club, and 4 townhouses. So here we have 7, 9, 11, and parts of 13 behind it. These were the doors to the mansion that were designed by Stanford White, the first architect. And these doors were bronze and were designed, as most Stanford White things were done to impress people with the fact that you were going into some place special. Now, these doors can't be seen anymore because they disappeared sometime when the Shriners owned the building. And we had been told that they were in the basement. So one day, several of us on the board decided, you know, let's just go take a look for those doors down in the basement. So we went down there, got filthy ransacking the basement, looking for through all kinds of junk that was down there, found the parts of the conservatory that had been taken down and so on, but sadly, no doors. So we still have to try and figure out what happened to the doors. The doors were paid for, designed, and desired by Mr. and Mrs. Robert Garrett, shown here, probably when they were in their 30s. The building's history starts 138 years ago when Mr. and Mrs. Robert Garrett were married in 1872, and they moved into 11 West Mount Vernon Place. While the newspapers of the day dubbed the house Mr. Garrett's Palace, in reality, it was Mrs. Garrett, Mary Frick Garrett, who was the prime mover behind creating this mansion. She looks like a very demure young lady in this photograph, but she grew into the social arbiter of Baltimore. As we'll see in a later photograph, she looks much more stately than she does here. She came up in a family that knew its own worth. Her father was a barrister and her mother was a descendant of a colonial governor of Virginia. And for example, although she lived only 2 blocks from Grace and St. Peter's Church, where she was a longtime parishioner, she was always driven to church. She would never walk. And the church service would not start until she had arrived. On the other hand, she was also a very generous philanthropist. And she always had the newsboys in for a Christmas party. She started a children's hospital in her husband's name, her first husband's name, Robert Garrett. She helped to endow a tuberculosis hospital, which was a specialty of her second husband, Dr. Jacobs. She willed her extensive art collection to the Baltimore Museum of Art. And she also donated her country property uplands to the Episcopal Diocese for, quote, a home for poor church women. So although she considered herself quite an elite person, she also recognized her responsibilities to the community. So the money to create the magnificent mansion, which amounted to $2 million during her lifetime, which is roughly $40 million today, came from stock in the B&O Railroad. The B&O Railroad, it's very hard for us to think of a railroad as being cutting edge technology, but in 1827, when it was inaugurated, it was cutting edge technology. Maybe think about Jeff Bezos and Amazon, you know, he's creating a whole new industry here. And they created a whole new industry with the B&O Railroad also. And the Garretts were amongst the first people to buy into the railroad. The railroad employed thousands and thousands of people in Baltimore, as well as generated lots of spin-off businesses. Some of you may have heard about the Iron Bridge construction and so on, and all of that spun off from having the steel works and the iron industry here in Baltimore because of the railroad. The heyday of the Baltimore Railroad was probably the early 1900s. Here was a image from their centennial, which was a big celebration they had in 1927. And you see it shows you the three stages of steam engines at the time. In the upper right is the Tom Thumb, the first steam engine in the 1830s. The next one to the left in the upper left is the Perkins, which was in 1863, and it was the most powerful engine of the day. The bottom image is of a, quote, modern 1920s steam engine. John Wart Garrett, who was Robert Garrett's father, was the president of the B&O for 30 years, from 1854 to 1884. He was reportedly a ruthless businessman, but he had to be able to deal with the other ruthless businessmen who owned national railroads. So he was somebody who was a very prominent and probably the most important businessman in Baltimore at the time. Has an interesting history with Abraham Lincoln too, but we won't get into that today. But John Wart Garrett gave Robert and Mary in 1872 when they married, number 11 West Mount Vernon Place, completely furnished as a wedding gift. Pretty nice little wedding gift, wasn't it? And they lived there until John Wart Garrett died in 1884. When he died in 1884, Robert and Mary decided it was time for them to build a house that was one in which he could entertain as the president of a national railroad should be able to entertain. So enter Stanford White, the most famous architect of the day. And if you look at those mustaches, you can see that he thought he was something really fine. And everybody else thought he was something really fine too. He was designing opulent homes for the wealthy families of New York and of Newport, Rhode Island. And he was somebody who decided that the way to design was to create forms that showed drama and power. And so when you look at, whoops, okay. This was one that was one of his public buildings. He also designed a lot of public buildings. The Washington Arch in New York was one, but this was his Madison Square Garden. It's a good example of how he used various kinds of historic references to build his building. Interesting thing about this building, though, was that he had an apartment here, and in 1906, he was actually murdered in the Madison Square Garden in the rooftop restaurant by Henry Thaw. White had seduced Thaw's wife, the actress Evelyn Nesbit, when she was 16 years old, and he was a little unhinged, and even though this was years ago, he still shot him dead in the top of the Madison Square Garden. I don't know, there are too many architects who can actually design a building for them to be shot in, but he did. So at any rate, he was quite the society fellow. And so he was somebody that anybody who was anybody would hire to be their architect. And of course, Mrs. Garrett, who was somebody, knew that she was hiring him to be her architect. So he was putting together number 11 and number 9 Mount Vernon Place. So you can see that the two right there in that drawing. This is a good slide to show you how Stanford White designed things. The drama of this particular slide is just amazing, with all the different curves and the different forms that he uses, layers upon layers of different embellishment. And the whole reason that he did this was to create an image of a place that was for fine entertainment, because that's what they did back in those days. So he created this dramatic entryway here. The signature piece of it is this spiral stairway. If you look back here, you can see the spiral jutting up behind the paneling. It's a spiral stairway that goes 3 stories up to the Tiffany Dome at the top of it. And this Tiffany Dome picture is not nearly as good as it is when you stand right down here at the bottom of that stairway and look up, up, up. The dome is much more colorful in person, and when the light's coming through, it is just magnificent. There was also an inglenook fireplace there that was not there to heat the room. It was just there because, you know, it was looking really nice. And this is the best picture to show you all the different parts of the foyer. You see the stairway curving to the left, and you're on the 2nd floor at this point, and you see that he was designing what could only be called a Renaissance gallery there. And when you look at the details, you see the Venetian chandelier hanging in the on the lower level, and on the upper level there are Tiffany windows designed by Louis Comfort Tiffany called the Standard Bearers, and those 2 Tiffany windows are just magnificent. You'll have to come one day and take a look. And if you look at the lower level underneath the 3-part window, there's a clear window there, but originally there was a window in there that was a Tiffany window also. Reportedly, it was there until once the Shriners needed some plumbing repairs and they were unable to pay for them, so they traded the Tiffany window to the plumbers so that they could satisfy his plumbing bill that way. An image of the Great Baltimore Fire also hangs in the foyer, and that's a nod to the current owners, the Engineers Club, which was formed after the 1904 fire to rebuild Baltimore. They've been rebuilding the mansion here for a lot less years than that, but they've been in the mansion since 1962. The westernmost part of the mansion, which was number 11, contains the most original Stanford White images. This is what's called the Volmer Room, and it's an oval room. If you look at it, you can see the curve to the ceiling and so on. And it was a very delicately feminine room. This was the room where Mrs. Garrett hosted her famous afternoon teas. Back in the day, afternoon tea was the way that people socialized, women particularly, and having a invitation to one of her teas was a much coveted item. If you look at the shape, you can see that the open doors leading into the room behind it are pocket doors that fall back into the oval walls, and the engineering of these was just amazing if you can think about how they could possibly do that. The Heritage Room, which was the room through that doorway, was the Garrett's dining room, and it has coppered ceilings. It has magnificent carved, you see the fireplace here across from it. There's a break front that were 17th century European pieces, and the walls are covered with these magnificent Brussels tapestries. The tapestries were glorious in their day. Sadly, even a casual glance at them nowadays shows that they're sadly in need of restoration. If anybody would like to donate $1.5 million to us, we'll be happy to do that. This is the other design that you can no longer find in the mansion. This was White's design for the drawing room. It was subsumed by later reservations by the second architect, John Russell Pope. But if you look at that, you'll see that it's very typical of what was called the aesthetic movement of the time, with layer upon layer of beautiful objects and opulent fabrics just put side by side. It's what we would call today very Victorian, but the gracious proportions of the room sort of absorb all of that various pattern and color. In 1896, Robert Garrett died. He had been ill for some time. He, as I said, became president of the B&O in 1884, had to resign in 1887 because of ill health. And for the next decade, then he was just really ill and was attended by his own private physician, Dr. Henry Barton Jacobs. Well, in 1902, Dr. Jacobs and Mrs. Garrett were married. This is a picture of Mrs. Garrett in her grande dame stage. Dr. Jacobs had become a distinguished physician at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. He specialized in tuberculosis research. And in those days, a physician was nowhere near the same social status as Mrs. Garrett was, nor did he have the economic status that Mrs. Garrett enjoyed. Theirs was one of the first prenups that I think was signed in Baltimore. But they lived very happily, even though she was 6 years older than he was, and so on. And they lived together until she died in 1933. As a present to him, upon their marriage, she bought number 7 Mount Vernon Place. And she wanted to make a library for him since he was quite a bibliophile. And so they hired this architect, John Russell Pope, to add number 9 and then later number 13 to the mansion. Now, you see John Russell Pope looks much more conservative than Stanford White did. No mustaches, 3-piece suit, etc. And he was actually a distant relative of Dr. Jacobs. And so he came in to become their architect, and Stanford White was no longer the architect for the Garretts. And while John Russell Pope didn't change the facade much, he added the third part on, the leftmost part of the mansion, but he really adhered to White's design to make that happen. But his design was much more neoclassical than it was Baroque or aesthetic, the way Stanford White's was. This was an image of Whitehome, which was the Garrett or the Jacobs cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, also designed by John Russell Pope. So this is the room that we see today, the drawing room in the Garrett-Jacobs Mansion. And this was a photograph from the early 1900s that appeared in the Architecture Digest. And it shows you how the room was furnished. And if you noted back in the drawing room image from Stanford White, the mirror and the fireplace are exactly the same as they were in that image, but all of the rest of it has changed. There's also a portrait on the wall of that is a portrait of Mrs. Garrett done by the French artist Cabanel. And the original of that portrait now hangs in the Baltimore Museum of Art. And we have a reproduction that's hanging in exactly the same spot in the drawing room in our mansion. And you see that she furnished it largely with reproduction French antiques, and many of the decorative pieces are Chinese. And this was very, very popular at the time. Here is the library, and if you look at the woodwork here in the library, you see it's much more restrained than the woodwork we saw in the foyer that Stanford White did. This is much more baronial in style and much less medieval than what Stanford White did. And the portrait that you see hanging over the mantelpiece here is also in the collection of the Baltimore Museum of Art. The Garrett-Jacobs Mansion Endowment Fund has installed an exhibition in the bookcases about the B&O Railroad. So when you come to take a look for yourself, you can enjoy learning about the railroad's history looking in the bookcases. This is the image of the Caen Stone Hall, which is the hallway which connects the library and the gallery ballroom and the stairway which descends into the supper room. And you can see that this was also used as a place to display her artwork. She was very fond of tapestries. I think it was popular at the time. But here is a detail of the most famous of all stone foyers. This marble foyer was the one from Breakers in Rhode Island that was in the Vanderbilt mansion. And it is all the most elaborate marble in the that you could see. And this was much less dramatic than the Breakers, but it was also marble on the floor, an iron and brass railing, and the walls were decorated as if they were stone, although it was all faux. This was a detail of the Stone Hall stairway, and you see the caduceus there, which was in homage to Dr. Jacobs. The stairway here descends in a broad stairs with a gentle descent and a gentle curve, and it's very graceful, a big difference from the drama of White stairway that is in the foyer. As you came through the Caen Stone Hall from either the drawing room or the library, you came into what was called the Long Gallery, or we refer to it as the Gallery of the Ballroom. And the painting that greeted you as you came in, if you look at the back of the stage, that painting, which also hangs in the Baltimore Museum of Art, is of King George IV in full regalia. So that this was to give you the idea that you were entering someplace that royalty abounded. Mrs. Garrett did not hold herself cheaply. All of these beautiful paintings that were on the walls were donated to the Baltimore Museum of Art. Quite a few of them can be seen hanging today in the Jacobs Gallery. There's a Rembrandt and a Van Ruysdael and a Frans Hals and so on, all of the old master paintings that she collected. And she also donated most of the money for the Jacobs wing of the Baltimore Museum of Art. And of course, she insisted that John Russell Pope would be the architect. What you see here in this historic photograph is what you would see today also, minus the paintings, but all of the architectural details are there. The sconces that you see are still there. The skylights to allow natural daylight to come in. The beautiful doors off to the right that led to the courtyard. The parquet floor. The wall coverings are reproduction, but they were actually made to the same specifications and in the same factory in France as the originals. This was used as a place where people performed also, including Rosa Poncell, who was our very famous Baltimore soprano. All kinds of concerts and events took place there on that stage. You're going to see that stage again later in another slide too. And below the ballroom was this supper club, or the supper room, and the supper room was where people who had been upstairs for an event would come down here and have supper, complete with dishes that were finest china, silver, and so on, and the silverware was plated with gold and so on. And this was the musicians' gallery where they could entertain you while you were having your supper. This was the Long Gallery that was built to house her art collection. 1915, her art collection had outgrown the ballroom space, and so she of course bought number 13 and took down part of that and built another room to house her paintings. This has now become part of the kitchen of the Engineers Club. And interestingly enough, they bought back the rest of number 13 when it was for sale in 2009 and used it to create this addition for an elevator that was just completed a couple years ago. Our second owners were the Shriners. They used the building until 1952 when the city decided that they were going to knock it down and make it into an addition to the Walters Art Gallery. It was the precursors of Baltimore Heritage that saved that from happening. So thank you, Johns. And then it languished for 10 years, fell on hard times until it was rescued by the Engineers Club in 1962. And they have spent over $8 million since the endowment fund was begun in 1992 in restoring the building. So here's what we see today that is the result of that. And we all enjoy the efforts of the Mount Vernon, of the Engineers Club, to be good stewards of the building. And here is our little promo at the end. If you feel like you'd like to donate to assist the efforts of maintaining the building, you can go to that area, that screen. Okay, I'm done, Johns. I sort of had to rush through the end there. I realized I was out of time.
You nailed it exactly in 30 minutes, Lisa. I think for those of you who want to log off, we'll see you next week, hopefully. But those of you who want to stay on, we'll take about maybe 5 or so minutes for questions. And the first one we have is, was Mary Frick related to the New York Fricks of the Frick Museum?
Distantly. They weren't a close relation, but everybody was a cousin, you know. But they were a distant relation.
Second one, when was the building listed on the National Register?
Let me go back here and show you. Okay. This photograph, for example, came from the Habs report, and that was in 1960. So these were all 1960 photos from the Habs report. And so that was about the time that the National Register nomination was being done.
Okay. Here's a question. You said the main Tiffany window in the front was traded to the plumber to pay the bill. Do you know who the plumber was or where the window went?
I do not know who the plumber was. I've heard that story, but from Ed Highmiller, but I don't know who the plumber was.
Bummer. Are the Volmer Room walls as orange or tangerine as they appear in your photo?
They're more red. It's just not a real good photo. They're more red than orange.
Okay, here we go.
Mrs. Garrett was very fond of the picture red, of the color red.
I think maybe this might be our last one, but was each addition newly constructed, or was each one a separate house that was somehow joined to the original mansion?
Well, when we were down in the basement looking for the doors, we looked at the construction in the basement, and you could see where each house had been added, but the construction in the for number 7, for example, was much more modern looking than the construction under number 11. So the thought we were having at the time was that number 7 was pretty much demolished, and then it was rebuilt to be what it is today.
And actually, we've got one final question. Do you know how many residences in total the Garretts had?
Well, let's see. There was the one in Deer Park. There was Uplands around Catonsville. They had a New York apartment. They had an apartment in France. 5 or 6, something like that.
Wait, we got 2 more quick ones if everybody's hanging in there with us. One is, what was the thinking on putting in the atrium? We love the outside courtyard.
The outside atrium was it was enclosing what had been an open courtyard, and the reason it was done was because it made a wonderful space for entertaining, and that's what the Garrett-Jacobs Mansion is really good for, is entertaining, and that's a terrific space. Last year we had the art show there, and it was a wonderful place to have an art show.
All right, final one. Are there any photos of the Central Conservatory in the Jacobs era?
No, sadly there are not. Not that I have ever seen, or not that anybody has ever told me about. So I'd love to see one if anybody might know where one is.
Okay, actually we're going to squeak, this will be the final. Whenever anybody says this is the final one, they really mean the final 3. So this is actually the final one. Did Mary have any children?
No. She and Mr. Garrett did not, and she and Dr. Jacobs did not. She was childless.
All right, I think with that, I'll say thanks, everybody, and thank you especially, Lisa, for sharing a lifetime of knowledge and research. And we will see you hopefully on another Friday afternoon. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Johns. Thanks, Nathan. Bye now.